uncle was quite an eccentric individual. He had achieved great success as a physicist and had reached the pinnacle of his career. Yet he surprised everyone by making a sudden decision to retire and relocate to his villa in the serene French countryside. The reason behind this drastic transformation remained a mystery to his friends and family. It wasn't as if he had a wife or children requiring his increased attention. In fact, he had comfortably embraced the life of a bachelor well into his 40s, with the financial means to support such a lifestyle. When questioned about his motives, he simply expressed his weariness of the urban chaos and his desire for the expanse to clear his thoughts. I can still vividly recall the day he arrived to pick me up from the quaint train station. My mother, his sister, eagerly rose to embrace him. Meanwhile, I remained seated on the bench, entranced by the undulating lavender fields that bordered the railway on both sides. I idly played with the bracelet my father had gifted me for my birthday. This marked my initial venture outside the city for an extended period, a prospect that under happier circumstances would have been truly thrilling. The reason my uncle had graciously offered me the opportunity to stay with him stemmed from my parents' tumultuous divorce proceedings. Both had agreed that I should be spared from becoming entangled in the crossfire until all legal matters were settled. "Mon caneton," he exclaimed, causing me to perk up. During my earlier years, whenever I was much younger, I used to throw fits every time he referred to me as his duckling. I would insist that he rename me after a more majestic bird, perhaps a falcon or an eagle. Although this elicited an eye roll from him, the familiar nickname carried a certain level of comfort. Eventually we reconciled, and after a swift and tearful farewell with my mother, he guided me back to his car. We reached an understanding that now that I was a grown-up girl, I could sit in the front seat alongside him, something my father still wouldn't allow. He was clearly attempting to lift my spirits in the best way he knew how. Although my grandmother and grandfather were never legally divorced, he was all too familiar with the experience of having parents who were constantly at odds and feeling helpless to intervene. We drove past the lavender fields and followed an unpaved dirt path. I observed with a touch of unease as the nearest semblance of a town diminished in the rear-view mirror, yielding to rolling hills and lush pastures. Soon enough, the only man-made structures visible were the concrete utility poles scattered across the landscape, yet even they were not immune to the relentless grasp of nature. I spotted a pair of white storks perched atop one of these poles. They should have begun their journey south by now, I mused. Summer was drawing to a close, and they faced a lengthy voyage ahead. I asked my uncle, "Jusqu'où est l'Afrique?" How far is Africa? A question that surprised him more due to my use of French than the nature of my inquiry. While my maternal family's roots trace back to Strasbourg, I hail from Berlin, where I was both born and raised, thanks to my father's origins. My uncle, harboring no affection for my father, never found reason to learn German. Consequently, when no translator was at hand, our conversations predominantly unfolded in English, the sole other language familiar to us both. I had imbibed it since kindergarten, while he had polished it over his extensive years of teaching abroad. "Très loin, very far," he responded, "farther than you can imagine." For some inexplicable reason, I interpreted this as a challenge. Fixing my gaze on the horizon, I conjured mental vistas of giraffes, leopards, and palm trees, of expansive savannas and impenetrable jungles, all elements my youthful mind associated with the enigmatic continent. Truth be told, I could have very well been staring in precisely the opposite direction of south, but my uncle would likely not have bothered to correct me either way. And here we are. The unexpected announcement he made roused me from my daydream. Nestled at the forefront of a charming birch grove stood the residence of my beloved uncle. It presented itself as more modest than my initial expectations, with just 2 stories and a gable roof. The wraparound porch boasted a distinctly Romanesque architectural style, rivaled only by the balcony adorned with a similarly intricate design. While undeniably picturesque, it didn't quite align with the grand mansion my younger self had pictured. Days melted into weeks, and the initial allure of the countryside waned quickly. It wasn't that I yearned for the gray monotony of the city, but I did miss the company of friends. On occasion I managed to cajole my uncle into playing trick-track with me. He simulated enthusiasm as best he could, yet it was evident that this arrangement wasn't entirely to his liking either. Most days he confined himself to his study, one of the many places I was strictly prohibited from entering. Not that I was particularly inclined to explore it. Through the slightly ajar door I caught glimpses of endless stacks of books and papers atop a cluttered desk, hardly captivating for someone my age. Then there were the inexplicable rules, like never ascending a particular flight of stairs, or only traversing one side of the property but not the other. Random portions of the house were off limits. There was even a stretch when I was forbidden from using the indoor restroom, necessitating visits to the outdoor pit latrine. Naturally, I adhered to my uncle's idiosyncratic mandates, yet I frequently quizzed him about their rationale. His response remained constant. These were age-old traditions that all residents here must adhere to, lest misfortune befall us. During a late afternoon in September, a significant event occurred that would have a lasting impact on my time there. The day was characterized by its warmth and humidity. The scent of ozone hung in the air, signaling an approaching storm. This forecast was validated by the massive clouds moving closer on the horizon. My uncle stood on the porch, observing as I played with a ball on the sun-baked patch of grass at the front. Each time I glanced his way, he responded with nods and smiles, which was all the approval I needed. I was simply delighted to have an audience for once. With a powerful kick, the ball rebounded off a stump and rolled down the parched lawn, prompting me to give chase. Fueled by its momentum, the ball followed its expected path. However, it abruptly halted, as if it had struck an invisible barrier. My sprint turned into a cautious walk. Even from my innocent perspective, it was evident that something was amiss. The farther I ventured, the more oppressive and dense the atmosphere grew, to the extent that I could sense its weight in my lungs. The ball's motionlessness was short-lived. Just as I neared it, it unexpectedly surged back towards me with even greater force. I swiftly dove to avoid it as it whizzed past, the sound of shattering glass reaching me from somewhere behind. "Get inside now," my uncle's voice urgently commanded. He didn't need to tell me a second time. Filled with fear and teetering on the brink of tears, I hurried back to the confines of the estate. Uncle stayed outside a while longer, but eventually he rejoined me. His face displayed an unfamiliar expression. I pulled at his sleeve, seeking both solace and an explanation. However, his distant gaze remained unchanged. It wasn't until my sniffling escalated into full-blown sobs that he finally acknowledged my presence. I could perceive the inner debate unfolding in his mind through his eyes. Even though I wasn't remotely prepared for the truth, there couldn't have been any other plausible explanation. Ghosts? That notion wouldn't have comforted me in the least. If anything, introducing another, even more unpredictable idea into the equation would have worsened things. He instructed me to get ready for dinner while he went upstairs to examine the shattered window. He assured me he'd explain everything after we'd eaten. Being granted entry into his study for the first time since I'd arrived felt exceptionally odd. An air of uncertainty lingered within me, as if I was possibly undergoing some sort of test. Noticing my hesitation, my uncle chuckled and reassured me with a gentle pat on the head. Then he instructed me to take a seat on the antiquated yet invitingly comfortable armchair, nestled snugly between two towering bookcases. He proceeded to retrieve a jar labeled Anomaly 005 from one of the shelves, unscrewed its tightly sealed lid, and turned it toward me. Initially, I was uncertain about what he was attempting to reveal to me. The transparent container seemed utterly void, until my uncle deftly slipped a piece of copper wire into it, swiftly sealing the lid afterward. I gazed in astonishment as the sample began to undergo rapid oxidation, its color shifting from reddish-brown to bluish-green within mere seconds. A full minute later, it had deteriorated significantly, corroding so intensely that its original form became nearly unrecognizable. Then, after another minute or so, the scant remnants of the object vanished completely, leaving behind no trace whatsoever. My uncle proceeded to elaborate, presenting this as a modest illustration of the uncharted realms awaiting documentation. He claimed that there was an inexplicable aspect to this specific tract of land, one that challenged the boundaries of established scientific principles. This land harbored localized zones where the natural laws and physics governing our world ceased to operate conventionally. Some of these phenomena were harmless, necessitating specific conditions for observation, while others, such as the gravitational anomaly I narrowly avoided firsthand, were far less discriminating. He employed elaborate terminology like transmutational and metaphysical, words that soared right over my young blonde head at that time. However, the core idea was this. The quest to recognize these unconventional events fueled his decision to forsake not just his profession, but also the allure of urban luxury. He did so in pursuit of the chance to be the pioneer in unraveling their enigmas. From that moment onward, our relationship underwent a transformation. I ceased being solely identified as my uncle's niece. An additional role had been bestowed upon me, that of his assistant. At the beginning, this was how he defined it, during the period when our relationship remained relatively innocent. He guided me through a thorough exploration of the anomalies he had managed to document, and in certain cases even confine. For instance, in the attic there existed a particular corner where the temperature held steady at precisely 1 degree C, slightly above freezing. In stark contrast, within the woods by the villa, there was a spot that triggered spontaneous combustion in any inorganic material it came into contact with, regardless of its inherent flammability. Then there were anomalies that exclusively reacted to specific metals and alloys, while being simultaneously repelled by non-conductive materials such as rubber or glass, which rendered their transfer feasible. A fully developed mind might have been easily overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of groundbreaking revelations presented all at once. Yet, as a child, my perspective on the world was still quite adaptable. Gradually, my fascination with fantasy novels was replaced by subjects like physics and chemistry. In just a few weeks, I comprehended concepts that students 5 years my senior hadn't even grasped the rudiments of. While my uncle might not have excelled as a guardian, I have to reluctantly admit that he was an exceptional educator. In between lectures, I occasionally undertook the task of testing some of the curiosities he considered sufficiently safe. My personal favorite was the contraption that acted as a miniature air funnel, causing any water passed through it to emerge with a delicate pink hue, an effect I now recognized was due to the presence of potassium permanganate. Whenever my mother called, I refrained from mentioning my diverse extracurricular activities. I knew she wouldn't comprehend them. She'd likely assume they were mere games, or worse yet, that her brother's sanity had waned. This pattern persisted until the onset of winter. This marked the turning point, the incident whose aftermath transformed this account from mere skepticism to a tale of my personal terror. Snowfall had been heavy. I was deeply engrossed in adorning the upstairs hallway, eagerly preparing for the upcoming holidays. Amidst this, an odd spectacle seized my attention. Looking out the closest window, beyond its frosty veneer, I noticed an unfamiliar abnormality suspended in the expanse before our dwelling. Unlike the others, this anomaly was impossible to disregard. It existed as a medley of colors and forms, hovering just above the snow. My intention was to summon my uncle, yet he was already making his way towards the entrance hall. Upon sighting my move to grab my coat, he objected, insisting I stay indoors as he ventured out to assess the situation. In a surprising turn, I decided to stand my ground. I hadn't come this far to still be treated as an ignorant child. My age should not be a factor when he'd coerce me into domestic roles or request my company under the pretext of loneliness at night. If I could endure all of that, I could surely make my own choices. The instance he ushered me into his room after a night of excessive drinking marked the point where he relinquished any claim to being a surrogate father. The sound of snow underfoot mingled with the porch light's persistent hum. The sky wore various shades of gray, its opacity rendering the exact time of day insignificant. The temporal anomaly itself stood as the most radiant element in our vicinity, though not easily observed directly. It wasn't blindingly bright, causing discomfort to the eyes. Rather, the nausea it stirred arose from somewhere deeper, more primal. I selected one color from the multitude that constituted the anomaly, observing its dissolution and dispersion within a ceaselessly swirling vortex of hues. The term psychedelic comes to mind, yet I am uncertain if the human mind can conjure something as surreal as this, even in the realm of hallucination. It was as if a fragment of our illusory world had detached, granting us a glimpse of the primordial essence that lay beyond. My intention is not to indulge in abstraction. Rather, it's an acknowledgement of the inadequacy of language, be it English or any other, to convey the deep, paradoxical, and existentially jarring nature of the spectacle we witnessed that day. Imagine being tasked with writing an essay about a book you've only read a single passage from. Once again, my youthful psyche was ill-equipped to confront the fundamental questions posed by the anomaly's very existence. Hence, I simply embraced it as it unfolded before me, a living Rorschach of multicolored patterns that induced discomfort when observed for extended periods. However, my uncle did not share in this luxury. The radiance emitted by the entity cast an entranced expression upon his face. Despite any discomfort he might have felt, he pressed on, moving closer to the blossoming lights. I endeavored to do the same, yet the sensation of vertigo became overwhelming. Each retch, every heave, felt like expelling fragments of my own soul. The ground beneath my feet assumed a liquid quality. My ears popped, and a throbbing sensation enveloped my temples, akin to the blare of an air raid siren near my head. Roughly 20 paces ahead, my uncle stood facing the shimmering mass, his figure outlined by the nebulous fusion of colors. He reached out. However, as he attempted to grasp its transient forms, the anomaly abruptly vanished. It didn't disintegrate into stardust or implode. Rather, it simply blinked out of reality, never to manifest again. Had I been the sole witness to this, I might have dismissed the entire ordeal as a mere dream. However, my uncle denied me that option. He became fixated, convinced that the unfolding events were not coincidental, but a deliberate effort by some higher force to establish a connection with us. He believed that these were profound messages from the cosmos affirming his chosen path. Though I acknowledged this as a possibility, it was unlike him to make such unfounded and fanciful deductions. I observed his mental faculties deteriorate gradually right before my eyes. Logic and reason were replaced by fervent conviction. Often he would walk past me as if I were part of the furniture. Eventually, he stopped leaving his study altogether, neglecting even his basic needs. I found myself abandoned, alone in a vast cold house situated on a remote stretch of rural land. I attempted to contact my parents, but the telephone was non-functional. While I initially attributed it to the weather, given what was to unfold, I wouldn't be surprised if my uncle intentionally cut us off from the outside world. Supplies were dwindling dangerously, and walking to the nearest town was not a viable option. The entrance to his study appeared even more imposing in the soft candlelight. Upon pushing it open, a strong, unpleasant odor hit me, making me cover my nose reflexively. The smell of ammonia was so overpowering that it brought tears to my eyes. Despite my apprehension, and with no better alternatives, I stepped across the threshold, stirring up a cloud of dust. A considerable portion of the room was engulfed in darkness. The only source of light came from a dim lamp lying next to the desk, seemingly knocked over. Whether this occurred accidentally or during a moment of manic frenzy, I couldn't ascertain. I exchanged my candle for the lamp and used it to illuminate my surroundings. Amid the prevailing disorder, the first detail that caught my attention was the collection of urine-filled jars arranged against the wall on my right. Nearby sat a filthy bucket, its contents evident but intentionally ignored. The room was littered with torn pages from books and research notes, strewn about without order. Some pages were shredded into pieces, while others were crumpled and repurposed for basic necessities. I proceeded further into the depths. The foul and stagnant air had deteriorated to a point where breathing was an arduous task, almost bringing about nausea. More unsettling were the subtle waves coursing through the air, a clear sign of an anomaly, and it seemed I had walked right into its epicenter. In hindsight, it was evident that those jars must have originated from this place. And then he came into view. Sunk at the distant edge of that wretched place, marinating in his own squalor, was the very man I sought. His unkempt hair appeared even more silver than I remembered, and his once precisely groomed mustache now extended over his upper lip. Behind him stood a weathered chalkboard, bearing the marks of countless lessons and presentations. Yet now it held just one phrase: "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. I called out, though no response or acknowledgement followed. Not at first. My assumption would have leaned toward his demise if not for the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. His eyelids began to flicker, and when they eventually snapped open, revealing bloodshot eyes beneath, a shiver ran down my spine. Mon caneton! The overly exuberant grin of my uncle generated an uncomfortable sensation, almost as if I were intruding merely by witnessing it. Stirred from his state of partial awareness, he leaped to his feet, clothes hanging loosely on his emaciated body like tattered rags. From his breast pocket, he extracted a piece of chalk and proceeded to draw fervent circles around the solitary quote etched on the black slate behind him, as if it held the solution to an enigma known solely to him. Yes, now it all makes sense. With a passionate smack, his hand connected with the surface, leaving his mark upon it. His strained laughter reverberated within the confined confines. The charade you put on was convincing, yes, but now I know the truth. You're not real. None of this, not a single bit of it, is real. His countenance brought to mind an apprentice striving to demonstrate his worth to his superior. That was the trial, correct? He grinned, almost certain of his imminent victory. Je l'ai fait. I did it. I have successfully completed your trial. Now reveal it to me. Show me the truth. His unsettling gaze was fixed directly on me, expecting me to unveil some hypothetical veil that would, in one swift move, validate each of his delusions. When met with nothing but my own frightened visage, a noticeable shift in his demeanor transpired. His anxious movements gave way to a fresh and subdued kind of insanity. Why? Why do you persist in this charade? It's done. The deceit has been uncovered. The decision has been made. You're nothing more than a notion in my mind, and I command you to transport me to the other side. He paced back and forth, fervently scratching his sweaty neck. My heart raced so rapidly that I feared it might either burst or leap out of my chest. During my upbringing, I clung to the belief that adults possessed unparalleled wisdom, adept at effortlessly navigating any predicament. To witness such a complete subversion of that notion, that lofty paradigm, felt almost surreal. Je sais si que vous complotez. I know what you are scheming. He suddenly turned and exclaimed, startling me to the point where I involuntarily let out an audible cry of fear. There was no trace of compassion left in his voice. If anything, my trembling only further aggravated him. After baring his teeth at me for a brief period, he firmly gripped both sides of the board, then pressed his forehead against it as well. His initial mutterings were too faint for me to discern, but the subsequent ones I most certainly caught. Not real. You aren't real. Apparition, mirage, vapor. And then the moment arrived. The line was spoken, a single sentence etched so deeply into my memory that it forever prevents me from viewing any man as anything other than a creature driven by instinct, hiding his predatory instincts behind a mask of culture and politeness. No matter how elaborate the facade, it crumbles under the right circumstances. At times, amidst my insomnia, I ponder if I can still hear it, emerging from some forgotten corner of my bedroom. You're not real, which means I can do whatever I please with you. I wasn't willing to wait for his attack. I swiftly pivoted, planning to sprint towards the exit, but an unfamiliar force seized my wrist. My father's bracelet. This anomaly reacted to the metals it was made of. I tugged and pulled, yet I couldn't escape the magnetic field of the distortion, not with the object that captivated it still attached to me. Eventually I managed to free my hand, but my uncle was already upon me. He savagely tore into me, his ragged nails tearing through both skin and fabric without discrimination. My attempts to defend myself only seemed to stoke his obsessive frenzy. Despite his weakened state, he remained stronger than I was. I'll refrain from delving into the details of what transpired until I gathered the courage to jab my thumb into his left eye, creating an opportunity for me to squirm out from underneath him. However, even that gained me little respite. By the time I was back on my feet, he had already recuperated. I painfully realized that I lacked the strength to overpower him or the distance to outrun him. So I did something that continues to baffle me to this day, how I managed to execute it. I recall reading an article that explored the concept of children displaying exceptional cognitive awareness in response to extreme stress. Its accuracy remains uncertain, yet if I were placed in that exact predicament now, I doubt I would possess the composure to react as adeptly as I did. I raised my arms, intending to use them as a shield against my uncle's advances, However, instead of doing so, I started clapping slowly. He halted, clearly puzzled. His confusion provided me with a strange sense of reassurance, and I intensified my applause. Despite the pain and humiliation I was experiencing, I managed to transform those emotions into a triumphant smile. "You're correct," I declared. "None of this is real. Well done. You've uncovered the truth." I spread my arms wide, emphasizing the point. His frantic eyes, one of which was swollen and noticeably red, darted around the room. "Two men's. You're lying." Spittle escaped from his mouth, landing on my face. In response, I simply shook my head. Despite his protests, it was clear he desperately wanted to believe me. He had no choice, as acknowledging the reality would mean facing the consequences of his terrible actions. "I never lied," I vaguely replied, then extended my palm to him. "Come, let me show you." Side by side, we ventured out into the wintry scenery. The gusty wind swept my hair, and the biting cold touched my exposed skin. I paid no attention to it. Considering all the hardships I had endured, the cold was a somewhat welcome discomfort in the grand scheme of things. "Do you see it?" I asked, pointing toward the horizon where the rising sun met the sweeping pale dunes. He complied by nodding affirmatively multiple times, displaying restlessness as he shifted from one foot to the other. Once esteemed as a professor with a respectable reputation, he was now diminished to a stumbling fool, a lobotomized being enclosed within a self-constructed realm. The vulnerability of the human mind is truly astonishing. "That's the direction you must proceed in. Keep walking and do not turn back. Is that clear?" He lowered his gaze, and our eyes connected, his vacant stare merging with mine. There existed nothing within, merely an absence of identity. I wished to summon a shred of compassion for him, yet I found myself unable. The wounds remained painfully fresh and cut unfathomably deep. "Hurry, move, go, or you'll miss your opportunity." And so he departed, plowing through the snow towards the expansive white expanse. The exact intent of his pursuit, assuming he indeed possessed a lucid objective at this juncture, remained open to interpretation. It was possible he genuinely harbored the belief that the environment around him was a simulated fabrication, within which he stood alone as a thinking entity. Irrespective of the reasoning, he didn't progress far. It is rather poetic that the very anomaly initiating my plunge into this abyss of madness would inevitably culminate it. The moment he crossed that threshold, his fate was already sealed. Much like my ball had abruptly and entirely halted, his body also encountered an instantaneous cessation, only to be forcefully expelled back with such magnitude that he was propelled into the air. He collided with the balcony, folding against its marble railing, and subsequently plunged headfirst onto the unyielding deck beneath. It goes without saying that he didn't survive. I struggled to feel grief for him. He possessed a remarkable intellect, yet sadly he was a repulsive human being, even before the onset of whatever madness befell him. He appropriated things from me that he had no right to claim, and growing up was irreversibly altered due to his actions. At times I like to contemplate the various directions my narrative could have taken. Perhaps in a parallel universe I continue on to lead a wholesome and personally satisfying life of ordinary contentment. However, considering all the occurrences I've detailed here, how could that ever be possible? How could anyone,